The moment you start explaining your boundaries, something shifts, but not in the way you think. You believe you're being calm, mature, controlled. You believe that if you just choose the right words, the right tone, the right timing, they will finally understand you. But they don't, and deep down, you've already felt that. Because no matter how clearly you explain, no matter how carefully you phrase it, the same lines keep getting crossed again and again and again. That's when frustration begins to grow. Not loud at first, just a quiet tension inside you. A replay loop in your mind. Maybe I should have said it differently. Maybe I wasn't clear enough. Maybe I overreacted. But what if the problem was never, what if, the moment you started explaining was the moment you lost your position? Because here is the truth most people don't want to face. When you explain your boundaries to someone who keeps crossing them, you are not reinforcing your limits. You are revealing how much you are willing to tolerate. And the wrong people don't misunderstand that. They study it. They watch how many times you repeat yourself. They observe how emotional you get. They measure how far they can go before you finally stop them, if you ever do. This is not random behavior. This is calculation, quiet, subtle, almost invisible, but precise. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Because what feels like disrespect is often something much colder than that. It is a test, not an emotional reaction, not a misunderstanding, a test. And every time you respond, you are giving them data. You are showing them exactly how to treat you without ever saying a word. That's why some people can meet you once and immediately know how far they can push. Not because they are smarter, but because they are watching more closely than you think. They are not listening to your words. They are reading your reactions. And reactions don't lie. You can say you value respect. You can say you have standards. You can say you won't tolerate certain behavior. But if your actions don't match that, if you keep explaining instead of enforcing, then your words become background noise. And people don't respond to what you say, they respond to what you allow. This is where most people get trapped. They believe respect is something you earn by being understood. So they try harder. They explain more. They soften their tone. They become more patient, more reasonable, more accommodating. But instead of gaining respect, they slowly lose it. Not all at once. Gradually, quietly, until one day they realize they are no longer being taken seriously at all. And the hardest part is, they don't understand why. Because from their perspective, they did everything right. They stayed calm. They communicated clearly. They tried to resolve things peacefully. But what they didn't see is that they were negotiating something that should have never been negotiable in the first place. Their own dignity. And dignity does not grow through explanation. It reveals itself through action, through what you tolerate and what you don't, through what you engage with and what you walk away from without a word. This is the shift that changes everything. The moment you stop trying to convince others to respect you and start observing how they respond when you don't explain yourself anymore, because that moment exposes the truth, not about them, but about the dynamic you've been participating in all along. And once you see that clearly, you begin to understand something most people never fully grasp. Respect is not given to those who explain themselves best. It is given to those who no longer need to. Disrespect is not random. It only feels that way when you're still looking at it from the surface. When you're inside the moment, when your emotions are involved, it looks like carelessness, misunderstanding, maybe even stress. You tell yourself they didn't mean it. You tell yourself they were just having a bad day. You give them reasons, you give them excuses. But step back for a second and look again, without emotion. The pattern becomes clearer. The interruptions that happen just a little too often The subtle jokes that always seem to land on you, the way your words get dismissed in a room full of people as if they carry less weight, the small boundary crossings that repeat, not once, not twice, but consistently, that is not random. That is observation followed by action. Because what you're dealing with is not confusion, it's measurement. People are constantly scanning for signals, not consciously all the time, but effectively. They are watching how you react when something feels slightly off. They are noticing whether you push back or whether you smooth it over. They are calculating the cost of disrespecting you. And if that cost is low, the behavior continues. If that cost is zero, it escalates. This is the part most people miss. They assume respect is given based on intention. That if they are kind, patient, understanding, others will respond in the same way. But social dynamics don't operate on intention. They operate on feedback, and feedback comes from behavior, not words. Every time someone crosses a line and nothing happens, that is feedback. Every time they make a remark and you laugh it off, even though it bothered you, that is feedback. Every time you feel disrespected but choose to explain instead of enforce, that is feedback. And feedback shapes behavior, not just yours, but theirs. Think about it like this. Imagine someone slowly pushing against a door. At first, just lightly. Testing. If the door resists, they stop. If the door moves, even slightly, they push again. A little harder this time, and again, until eventually the door is fully open. Not because they forced it, but because there was nothing stopping them. That's how boundaries are tested, quietly, gradually, without announcement. No one walks into your life and immediately disrespects you at full intensity. It starts small, almost invisible. A comment here, a tone there, a slight dismissal, a subtle shift in how they speak to you. And each time they watch, not your words, your reaction. Because your reaction answers the only question they're really asking. How far can I go with this person? And whether you realize it or not, you are answering that question every single time. This is why two people can be treated completely differently by the same individual. One gets respect, the other gets overlooked, interrupted, dismissed, not because one is more worthy, but because one established resistance and the other didn't. Respect is not evenly distributed. It adjusts based on what is allowed. That may sound uncomfortable, but it is also freeing because it means the dynamic is not fixed. It is responsive. It changes based on what you tolerate and what you don't. Once you see this clearly, something shifts internally. You stop taking every act of disrespect personally. You stop asking, why are they doing this to me? Because that question keeps you in a passive position. It keeps you focused on their intention instead of your response. And your response is the only part of this equation you actually control. The better question becomes, what are they learning about me right now? Because in every interaction, something is being taught, not through explanation, through behavior, through presence, through what you reinforce, without even realizing it. And once you understand that, disrespect stops feeling like an emotional event. It starts looking like a pattern, a system, a test that repeats until it gets a clear answer. And the moment you begin to see it that way, you are no longer just reacting to it. You are studying it. Every reaction you give becomes an answer. Not the answer you think you're giving, but the one they're actually reading. Because people don't learn how to treat you from your intentions. They learn from your patterns, from your consistency, from what you do under pressure. Think about the last time someone crossed a line with you. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, almost deniable way. Maybe they interrupted you mid-sentence, as if what you were saying didn't matter. Maybe they made a joke at your expense and disguised it as humor. Maybe they dismissed your opinion with a tone that felt slightly off, but not enough to call out without making it a big deal. In that moment, something happens inside you. A small spike of discomfort. Your body notices it immediately, but your mind hesitates. And in that hesitation, you choose a response. Most people fall into one of three patterns. The first is anger. Immediate, emotional, reactive. You push back. You raise your voice. You try to correct the behavior right there in the moment. And while it may feel powerful, what it actually signals is something else. It shows that you are emotionally invested, that they can move you, that with the right words, the right tone, the right pressure, they can control your internal state. And once someone knows they can control your emotions, they hold leverage over you. The second response is silence. Not the calm, deliberate silence of control, but the quiet silence of avoidance. You feel the discomfort, but you suppress it. You tell yourself it's not worth it. You look away. You let it pass, hoping it doesn't happen again. But silence, when it comes from fear, teaches a different lesson. It tells them there is no resistance here, that the line can be crossed and nothing will happen. And when nothing happens, the behavior doesn't disappear, it grows. The third response is the most common and the most deceptive. Over-explaining. You stay calm, you choose your words carefully, you try to be reasonable, fair, mature. You explain why what they did bothered you. You break it down. You clarify your intentions. You hope that if they just understand you better, they will finally respect you. But what they see is not your clarity. They see your need, the need to be understood, the need to be seen as reasonable, the need to be validated. And need is the easiest thing to use against someone. Because the moment you need someone to see you a certain way, you give them power over how you feel. This is where the dynamic shifts quietly. Almost invisibly, you think you are maintaining control because you are staying calm. But underneath that calm, there is dependence. And dependence creates imbalance because now, whether you realize it or not, you are waiting for their response, their acknowledgement, their agreement, their respect. And that waiting position is a position of weakness, not because you are weak, but because you placed your center outside of yourself. This is why the same situations keep repeating, not because you didn't explain well enough, but because your reaction became predictable. And predictability is control. When someone can predict how you will react, they no longer need to guess. They no longer need to test carefully. They already know the outcome. They know if they push, you will explain. If they provoke, you will defend. If they dismiss, you will try harder to be heard. And once that pattern is clear, the test is over. The result is already in. This is the part that's difficult to accept because it forces you to look at something deeper than their behavior. It forces you to look at your own, not with blame, but with clarity. Because the question is no longer, why do they keep doing this? The real question is, what have I been consistently showing them? Every reaction you give is a signal. Every emotional response is information. Every attempt to explain, defend, or smooth things over is shaping the way you are perceived. And perception drives behavior. This is why two people can say the exact same words, but receive completely different responses. One is respected, the other is ignored. The difference is not in what they said, it's in what they've consistently shown over time. And once you see that clearly, something inside you begins to shift. You stop focusing on crafting the perfect response. You stop trying to say it better, explain it better, handle it better, because you realize it was never about the words. It was always about the pattern. And patterns don't change through explanation. They change through interruption, through doing something different than what is expected, through breaking the cycle that has been quietly teaching people how to treat you all along. The most dangerous habit you've been taught is the need to explain yourself. Not because explaining is always wrong, but because you've been conditioned to believe that explanation creates respect, that if you just communicate clearly enough, people will adjust. That logic leads to fairness. That clarity leads to understanding. But in certain dynamics, especially with people who repeatedly cross your boundaries, explanation does something very different. It doesn't strengthen your position, it weakens it. Because the moment you start explaining your boundary, you turn it into something negotiable. You take something that should be absolute and present it as a discussion. And discussions invite debate. Debate invites resistance, and resistance invites more testing. Think about it carefully. When you say, I didn't like that, because you are opening the door. You are stepping into a frame where your feelings need to be justified, where your reaction needs to make sense to them, where your boundary needs to be approved before it is respected. And the moment your boundary depends on their understanding, it is no longer a boundary. It is a request. This is why over-explaining quietly erodes your authority, because instead of holding your ground, you are trying to convince them to meet you there. You are presenting your dignity as something that needs validation. And validation is never stable. It depends on the other person, their mood, their perspective, their willingness, their interest. And the moment your dignity depends on something unstable, you become unstable too. This is the loop that traps most people. They explain, it doesn't work, so they explain again, with better words, better tone, more patience, more detail. They refine the message. They soften the delivery. They try to remove any possible misunderstanding. But the outcome stays the same, because the problem was never the clarity of the message. It was the act of explaining itself. You were speaking to someone who already understood. They just didn't care. And that distinction changes everything. Because once you realize that, you stop trying to educate people who are not confused. You stop wasting energy trying to make your boundaries sound reasonable, because a real boundary does not need to sound reasonable to anyone. It only needs to be clear to you. And clarity does not come from words. It comes from behavior, from what happens after the line is crossed. This is where the shift becomes uncomfortable, because it requires you to let go of something that feels safe. Explanation feels safe because it keeps you in control of the narrative. It allows you to feel composed, logical, mature. It gives you the illusion that you are handling things the right way. But underneath that, there is often fear. Fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being seen as harsh, cold, or difficult. So instead of enforcing the boundary, you explain it, you soften it, you wrap it in language that makes it easier for the other person to accept. But in doing that, you also make it easier for them to ignore, because people don't respond to how well you explain your limits. They respond to what happens when those limits are crossed. If nothing changes, nothing changes. This is the paradox. The more you explain, the less your words matter. The more you justify, the more your position weakens. The more you try to be understood, the more you signal that their understanding is required for your stability. And that signal is subtle but powerful, because it tells them exactly where your center is. Not within you, but within their response. And once someone sees that, They don't need to respect your boundary. They only need to manage your reaction. This is why the shift is not about finding better words. It is about removing the need for them entirely. It is about reaching a point where your boundary is no longer something you talk about, but something you live, something that is felt through your actions, not negotiated through your explanations. Because the moment you stop explaining your worth, something changes in the dynamic. The conversation becomes quieter, shorter, simpler. There is less friction, not because people suddenly understand you better, but because there is nothing left to debate. You are no longer offering your dignity as a topic of discussion. You are holding it as a fact, and facts do not argue. They stand. There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, where everything begins to change, not outside of you, inside. It's the moment you stop reacting like someone being judged and start observing like someone who is studying the situation. Up until now, every interaction has pulled you inward. You felt it personally. You experienced it emotionally. You ask yourself, why are they doing this to me? And that question kept you trapped because it placed you at the center of the problem. It made their behavior feel like an attack, something you needed to defend against, fix, or resolve. But the moment you shift that question, something else happens. You step half a step back mentally, and instead of asking, why me? You begin asking, what are they trying to gain? That question changes everything, because now you're no longer inside the emotion, you're outside of it, looking at the pattern. And patterns are easier to understand than emotions. Patterns reveal intention, not emotional intention, but functional intention. What is this behavior trying to produce? Attention, control, a reaction, a sense of superiority? Once you start looking through that lens, the dynamic becomes clearer. The interruptions are no longer random. They are attempts to dominate the space. The jokes are not harmless. They are subtle ways to lower your position while maintaining plausible deniability. The dismissals are not misunderstandings. They are signals testing whether your voice carries weight or not. And once you see that clearly, your emotional response begins to change. Not because you're forcing it, but because the illusion is gone. You're no longer surprised. You're no longer confused. You're no longer trying to interpret what just happened. You understand it. And understanding creates distance. This is where your power begins to return. Not in a loud way, not in a confrontational way, but in a quiet, controlled way. Because when you observe, instead of react, you interrupt the pattern. You stop feeding it immediate data. You stop giving them the quick emotional response they are expecting, and that pause, even if it's just a few seconds, is enough to change the entire interaction. Think about how most people respond in real time, instantly, emotionally, predictably. Someone says something sharp, they defend. Someone pushes, they push back. Someone provokes, they react. It's automatic. And because it's automatic, it's easy to control. But when you pause, when you don't immediately respond, something subtle happens. The script breaks. The expected reaction doesn't arrive. The tension shifts. And in that moment, you are no longer participating in the same dynamic. You are evaluating it. You are deciding whether what was said even deserves a response at all. And that decision is where control lives. Because not everything deserves your attention, not everything deserves your energy, not everything deserves access to your mind. But when you are reactive, you don't get to choose. You respond to whatever is thrown at you. When you are observant, you choose what enters. and what doesn't. This is the difference between being controlled by the interaction and controlling your place within it. And once you begin to operate this way, something else becomes clear. Disrespect starts to lose its emotional charge. It doesn't hit the same. It doesn't linger the same, because you're no longer interpreting it as a personal attack. You're seeing it as information, data, a pattern being revealed in real time. And information does not need to be taken personally. It needs to be understood. This is the shift from reaction to awareness, from emotion to observation, from being inside the moment to standing just outside of it with clarity. And that clarity is quiet. It doesn't argue, it doesn't rush, it doesn't try to prove anything. It simply sees. And when you see clearly, you stop playing roles that were never yours to begin with. You stop being the one who needs to explain, the one who needs to defend, the one who needs to be understood. Instead, you become the one who decides what matters, what doesn't, what stays, and what gets left behind without a word. There is a form of strength that most people misunderstand. It doesn't look aggressive, it doesn't sound loud, it doesn't try to dominate the room or win the conversation. In fact, to an untrained eye, it can almost look like indifference. But it isn't indifference. It is something far more precise. It is detachment, not emotional shutdown, not coldness, not pretending you don't care. Real detachment is clarity. It is the ability to step just far enough back inside your own mind to see what is happening without being consumed by it. Most people don't have this distance. When something happens, they are immediately inside it. Their thoughts react, their emotions spike, their body follows. And before they even realize it, they are already responding, already pulled into the current of the interaction. But detachment interrupts that. It creates space, a small gap between stimulus and response. And inside that gap is control. Imagine a scientist observing a reaction inside a glass container. The chemicals mix, the reaction intensifies, it bubbles, it changes color, it becomes volatile. But the scientist does not panic. The scientist does not jump into the container. They don't take it personally. They observe, they measure, they understand. That is the posture you begin to develop. The interaction is the reaction. The words, the tone, the behavior, all of it is happening inside the container. And you are standing just outside of it, watching. Not detached from reality, but detached from impulsive reaction. This is where your power stabilizes. Because when you are no longer inside the emotional surge, you are no longer predictable. And when you are no longer predictable, you are no longer easy to control. Think about what usually happens when someone makes a cutting remark. There is an immediate impulse to respond, to defend, to correct, to restore your position as quickly as possible. That impulse feels urgent, it feels necessary, but most of the time, it is not coming from strength, it is coming from discomfort, a need to resolve the tension, a need to fix how you are being perceived in that moment. Detachment removes that urgency. It allows you to sit with the moment without rushing to escape it. Someone says something sharp, and instead of reacting instantly, you pause, not dramatically, not as a tactic, naturally. You let the words exist without immediately accepting them. You examine them quietly. Does this deserve a response? Is there anything here that actually requires my attention? Or is this simply an attempt to pull me into a reaction? That question alone changes everything, because now you are not reacting to what was said. You are deciding whether it matters. And most things don't. This is the part that shifts your entire presence. When people realize that their words don't immediately move you, something changes in how they approach you. Not because you told them to respect you, but because they can feel that your internal state is not easily disturbed, and that stability is what commands respect. Not force, not dominance, stability, the kind that does not need to prove itself, the kind that does not rush to defend itself, the kind that does not react just because something happened. This does not mean you become passive. It does not mean you tolerate everything. It means your response becomes deliberate, chosen, controlled. When something truly matters, you respond clearly, directly, without excess emotion, without over-explaining, without trying to win, just stating what is real and leaving it there. But when something does not matter, you let it pass. Not because you are weak, but because you understand that not every battle deserves your attention. This is the difference between someone who is reactive and someone who is grounded. One responds to everything, the other chooses. And choice is power. Over time, this detachment becomes natural. You don't have to remind yourself to stay calm. You don't have to force yourself to pause. It becomes your default state. You listen, you observe, you decide. And because of that, your presence changes. You are no longer pulled into every emotional exchange. You are no longer trying to control how others see you. You are no longer reacting from insecurity or urgency. You are simply steady. And that steadiness does something subtle but powerful. It removes the reward from disrespect, because disrespect feeds on reaction. It looks for movement, for emotion, for engagement. And when it doesn't find it, it begins to lose its purpose. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, quietly, the same way your shift began. Because the real power was never in controlling what others do, it was in mastering how you respond. And once that mastery begins to take shape, everything around you starts to reorganize itself in response to it. At first, when you stop reacting, it feels like things should get easier, quieter, more stable. You expect that once you remove the emotional response, the tension will fade, that the other person will adjust, that the dynamic will soften. But what actually happens is the opposite. They push harder, the tone sharpens, the words become more direct, the behavior becomes more obvious. It feels like things are getting worse. And this is the moment where most people break, because they misinterpret what they are seeing. They think, I made it worse. I should go back to how I was. At least before, it wasn't this intense. But what you're witnessing is not failure, it's exposure. You didn't make the situation worse. You made the old pattern stop working. And when a pattern stops working, it doesn't disappear quietly, it escalates. Think about something simple. You press an elevator button and it doesn't light up. What do? You press it again, maybe a little harder this time, then again, and again. You don't immediately assume it's broken, you assume it just didn't register, so you apply more pressure. Human behavior works the same way. When someone is used to getting a reaction from you, and suddenly they don't stop immediately, they intensify, louder words, sharper comments, more dramatic behavior, not because they suddenly became worse, but because the old method is no longer producing results. This is what psychologists call an extinction burst, a spike in behavior when the expected reward disappears. And in relationships, it can feel overwhelming. You may be accused of being cold, distant, different. You may hear things like, "You've changed," or "What's wrong with you lately?" Old situations may be brought up again, old mistakes resurfaced, the pressure increases, and all of it is designed, consciously or not, to pull you back into your previous role, back into reacting, back into explaining, back into feeding the dynamic that used to work. This is the real test, not the disrespect itself, but your ability to remain steady when the intensity rises, because this is where your old habits will try to take over. Your mind will look for relief. It will want to restore the previous balance to make things calm again. And the fastest way to do that is to go back to what you used to do, to explain, to defend, to engage emotionally. And if you do, the pattern resets. It learns something important. It learns that it just needed to push harder, that your boundary was not fixed. It was flexible under pressure, but if you don't return to the old response, something else happens. Slowly, quietly, the escalation loses energy because it is no longer being rewarded. The reactions they were expecting don't arrive. The emotional engagement they relied on is gone. And without that, the behavior has nothing to feed on. This stage requires discipline, not dramatic strength, not confrontation, just consistency. The ability to remain the same even when the environment around you becomes unstable, because consistency is what breaks patterns, not intensity. Anyone can stay calm when things are easy. But when the pressure rises, when the tone changes, when the accusations become sharper, that's when your stability is tested. And that stability communicates something far more powerful than words ever could. It shows that your behavior is not dependent on theirs, that your state is not controlled by their actions, that your boundary is not something that adjusts based on how hard they push, and that realization, even if it's never spoken out loud, is felt, because people adapt to where they find resistance and where they don't find reward. Over time, the repeated escalation becomes exhausting, like pressing a button that never responds. Eventually, they stop, not necessarily because they changed internally, but because the strategy no longer works. And this is where the dynamic begins to shift, not through force, not through argument, but through absence. The absence of reaction, the absence of emotional fuel, the absence of the version of you that used to participate in the cycle. And in that absence, something new takes its place. Not louder, not more aggressive, just steadier. More grounded, more difficult to move. And once that steadiness becomes consistent, the test loses its power, because there is nothing left for it to measure. Even when you begin to master your reactions, even when you stop explaining, stop engaging, stop feeding the pattern, there are still moments when something hits. A word, a tone, a comment that lingers longer than it should. You stay quiet on the outside, but inside something moves. A slight tension, a thought that repeats, a feeling you can't immediately dismiss. And this is where the deeper layer begins. Because at this point, it's no longer about them. It's about you, not in a blaming way, in a revealing way. Because the truth is, not every insult lands. Some pass through you without resistance. They don't stick, they don't echo, they don't matter. But others do. And the difference is not in the words themselves. It's in what they touch inside you. An insult only has weight when it connects to something that already exists. A doubt, a fear, a question you haven't fully answered for yourself. That's why the same words that mean nothing coming from one person can feel heavy coming from another. It's not logic, it's alignment. They touch something real, something unresolved. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said that what irritates us about others reveals something within ourselves, not because the other person is right, but because they exposed a place where you are still uncertain, still sensitive, still unsteady, and that is not weakness. It is information, but only if you're willing to see it that way. Most people don't. They stay focused outward, they replay the moment, they analyze the other person's behavior, they try to understand why it happened, but they never look at why it stayed, why it lingered, why it repeated itself in their mind long after the moment was over, because that question is uncomfortable. It requires honesty. If someone calls you incompetent and it stays with you for days, what part of you feels uncertain about your ability? If someone calls you unworthy and it echoes, where does that doubt already exist? The insult is not the root, it is the trigger. And once you understand that, something shifts again. You stop trying to silence the outside world and start understanding your inner one. Because as long as there are parts of you that you are avoiding, those parts remain vulnerable. They remain easy to access, easy to provoke, easy to manipulate. This is how certain people seem to know exactly what to say. It's not intuition, it's pattern recognition. They test different angles, different comments, different tones, and they watch closely for the reaction, the slight change in your expression, the shift in your energy, the hesitation in your voice. And once they find the point where you react, they return to it again and again. Not because they are powerful, but because that point is still unguarded. This is why the real protection is not a sharper response. It's deeper self-acceptance, the kind that removes the leverage entirely. Because when you fully acknowledge your imperfections, your doubts, your unfinished parts, they lose their power over you. If you already know where you are still growing, no one can expose it in a way that destabilizes you. If you already accept your flaws, no one can use them to shame you, because there is nothing left to reveal, nothing left to weaponize. This doesn't mean you stop improving. It means you stop hiding. You stop pretending to be complete when you are still in progress. You stop needing to appear strong and start becoming stable. There is a difference. Appearing strong requires constant defense, constant control, constant effort to maintain an image. Being stable requires none of that. It is grounded, quiet, unaffected by surface-level attacks, because it is built on something deeper than perception. This is where your identity shifts. You no longer define yourself based on what others say, or how they react, or whether they understand you. Your sense of self becomes internal, self-defined, rooted in your own awareness, your own standards, your own growth, and from that place, criticism becomes information, not identity. If there is truth in it, you adjust quietly, without drama. If there is no truth, you let it pass, without resistance, without attachment. Either way, you remain steady. And that steadiness changes how everything feels. Words that once triggered you now pass through without weight. Comments that once lingered now disappear quickly. Not because people stop speaking, but because there is nothing inside you for those words to attach to. This is the deeper transformation. Not controlling others, not silencing disrespect, but removing its ability to affect you at all. Because once there is no internal hook, there is nothing left for the external world to grab. And when that happens, your presence changes in a way that cannot be faked. You are no longer reacting from hidden doubt. You are responding from clarity. And clarity does not need to defend itself. There is one decision, quiet, internal, almost invisible, that changes everything. Not your words, not your tone, not your strategy. Just one shift in how you see people. And once it happens, you stop playing a game you didn't even realize you were in. The decision is this: you let go of the hope that they will change. Not dramatically, not with anger, not with resentment, quietly, completely. Because as long as a part of you still believes they will eventually understand, eventually respect you, eventually become the version of them you keep imagining, you remain tied to them. Not to who they are, but to who you hope they will become. And hope in the wrong place is a trap. It keeps you explaining. It keeps you waiting. It keeps you investing energy into something that has already shown you its pattern. You replay conversations in your head thinking next time will be different. You choose your words more carefully, hoping this time it will land. You stay patient, hoping they will recognize your effort, but nothing changes, not in any real, consistent way, because you are not responding to reality. You are responding to potential, and potential is not real. Behavior is, patterns are, consistency is. This is the shift that most people resist, because letting go of hope feels like giving up. It feels harsh. It feels final. But it is not giving up on people. It is giving up on illusion. It is choosing to see clearly instead of seeing what you want to see. When you look at someone not through their promises, not through their words, not through their good moments, but through their repeated behavior, something becomes undeniable. This is who they are right now, not who they could be, not who they were once, who they are consistently. And once you accept that, without anger, without drama, without needing to change it, your behavior begins to adjust naturally. You stop trying to fix them. You stop trying to educate them. You stop trying to win them over, because there is nothing left to negotiate. They are showing you exactly how they operate. And now you decide what to do with that information. This is where control returns to you. Not control over them, control over your access, your time, your energy, your attention. These are not unlimited resources, and for a long time, you may have given them freely, believing that if you showed enough patience, enough understanding, enough consistency, the dynamic would improve. But when respect is missing, giving more does not fix the problem. It deepens it. Because generosity without boundaries becomes permission, so you adjust quietly, not as punishment, as protection. You become selective. Conversations become shorter. Engagement becomes intentional. You respond when necessary and nothing more. You remain calm, but not open. Polite, but not available. You stop offering parts of yourself to someone who has shown they don't value them, not out of anger, but out of clarity. And this is where something subtle begins to shift. When people can no longer access you the way they used to, they notice. Not always consciously, but they feel it. The jokes don't land the same. The comments don't trigger the same reaction. The dynamic they relied on stops working. Some will push briefly, testing if the old version of you is still there. But when they realize it's not, they adjust. Some will step back, some will become more respectful, some will leave entirely. And all of those outcomes are information, because your goal was never to change them. It was to change your position within the dynamic. And once your position changes, everything else reorganizes around it. This is the final shift. You are no longer negotiating your dignity. You are no longer explaining your worth. You are no longer reacting to every provocation. You're operating from something stable, internal, self-defined. And that stability is felt. It doesn't need to be announced. It doesn't need to be proven. It shows in how you respond, in what you tolerate, in what you ignore, in what you walk away from without needing closure, because you no longer need them to understand you in order to respect yourself. And that is where the noise begins to fade. Not because the world suddenly becomes kinder, but because you are no longer available to everything that once disturbed you. The conversations become quieter. The conflicts become fewer. The emotional spikes become rare. And in that space, something else appears. Not emptiness, not isolation, peace. The kind that doesn't come from controlling others, but from no longer being controlled by them. And once you reach that point, you realize something that was always there, just hidden beneath all the noise. Respect was never something you had to chase. It was something that emerged the moment you stopped abandoning yourself to receive it.